Welcome back to our Introduction to Western Literature class. This will be starting our first unit. We'll be looking at short story. Alex is going to walk us through short story. I'm excited. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I want to encourage you as we move on, just as a reminder, remember you are to take ownership of what you're doing. Do the work that it takes to have the ownership of what we're learning. We're not just getting through something. We are pursuing something that I believe, Alex believes, will have an impact on how we think, how we perceive, how we understand reality. And hopefully in a way that does it eternally and causes us continually to come face to face with our God and His glory. Alex, take us on.
I'm really excited to be doing short story. It's one of my favorite genres, and I think there's just something about stories that we're all drawn to as people. They grab our attention. They have a special way of conveying their point and showing the lesson or the theme that they want to show through. And one of the things I just wanted to say at the start of the class is that people have been telling short stories for a long time, for thousands of years. I mean, we look back in the New Testament, we see Jesus telling a form of short stories, parables. They were very relevant to the context where they took place. They had a specific point that they were wanting to convey. And so as we're getting into short story, I just want us to think about that. There's something special about stories, and especially shorter ones that you can sit down, you can read them in just a few minutes or an hour, and there's something special in what can be conveyed there. So,
can I jump in real quick? Just give you an idea of the format. Instead of Alex just sitting here doing a lecture, we kind of make this little coffee table, have a little coffee cup, whatever it is, and we're going to be having a conversation. And Alex is going to be walking us through it, but every now and then I might jump in and ask a question and try to clarify something. But we're really going to do this in a sense as kind of at the coffee table with you, thinking about short stories. So just to start that off, Alex, what are some of your favorite short stories?
Some of my favorite short stories are the ones we're actually going to be doing in our class, ones that we're going to be covering. I like stories that are set in a cultural context that we can understand. So even more than fantasy stories or science fiction stories, I like those stories that are set with characters you might actually meet, or places that you might visit at some point, or dealing with thoughts and themes that you might actually encounter. And I think you'll find that you can relate to the characters and the themes and the stories that we'll be dealing with, even if they're from an older time than we are, and we might not be in exactly the same cultural context. And so for that reason, we're going to be focusing in on stories set in the 19th and 20th century, so a little bit closer to our time today. And I just wanted to read a quick definition of short stories. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I would encourage you, if you have a chance, you can go read the article that they wrote on short story, which is very good. So, but here's just a quick definition from them. They say the short story is usually concerned with a single effect, conveyed in only one or a few significant episodes or scenes. The form encourages economy of setting, concise narrative, and the omission of a complex plot. Character is disclosed in action and dramatic encounter, but is seldom fully developed. Despite its relatively limited scope, though, a short story is often judged by its ability to provide a complete or satisfying treatment of its characters and subject. Elijah, could you give our students just maybe a quick definition of setting? So I think sometimes that's something we're just not really sure what's going on with that.
When we're talking about a setting, we're talking about the location, the not only the location geographically, but also in time. So time and space, so to speak. That kind of confines and defines what's going to happen within our story. And if in short story, it's confined to just one. We don't get to change our time and space and travel over many years and things like that. You'll be reading a novel, and a lot of times you'll see we can jump lifetimes if we need to. Mm-hmm. Short story, that's just not happening.
Yeah.
We'll be in that one time and space.
Right. So when it says economy of setting, we're talking about more of a limited, concise setting, as opposed to some of the longer settings, like Elijah said, that you'll see in novels. And what I wanted to do really quick is just contrast. I know we haven't gone through the novel or the drama genres yet, but just give a quick contrast between short story and those genres when it comes to some of these things. And so we'll start with length. That's the obvious one that comes first. And one of the examples, one of my favorite novels, Les Miserables, fantastic book, worth a read. But if you were just to look at the length, short stories tend to be between, a lot of times 1,000 and maybe 6,000 words at most. Les Miserables is 1,400 pages. So it's an epic. It covers a significant amount of time. And so that's just a significant difference. You'll see obviously dramas are a little shorter, but still longer. You could read it in multiple sittings, whereas a short story is intended to be consumed in one sitting. It's intended for you to sit there and you can follow the entire story. You can get the entire line and come away with that one point in just one reading, which is a lot of times the goal. Setting, another thing that we just talked about. In the short story, setting is going to be limited to one, maybe at most 2 locations, but really one setting, because it's really one time and place. There's not a lot of time for things to change. And again, if you were to contrast that with Les Miserables, we're talking about a story that covers multiple decades, all set in the country of France, but a France that changes enormously over the course of the story. So again, just a lot of change taking place, and that's not unintentional. So in the short story, the setting is there, it provides the backdrop to the story, but we're really not getting a lot of development, or the theme is not being seen so much through the setting, if that makes sense. If you're looking at a novel, a story like Les Miserables, the setting, what's going on in France, what's going on in that time and place, has a lot to do with how the story and the themes are developing. In the short story, the setting is just really a backdrop that just kind of serves as for the point to go through. So another significant difference is character development. So in a short story, characters do not really develop over the course of the story. They really stay the same, and that's a significant difference. Again, in a story like Les Miserables, you see in Jean Valjean, the main character, a lot of development over the course of his life. And in the other characters, even Javert, who is the antagonist, in one sense, the stalwart character, even has some development in his life at the end of the story. Whereas a short story, again, the point is not that the characters are changing. The point is, here's the setting, here's the characters, and here is the point that the author is making.
You and I have talked a lot about that several times, where often you'll finish a short story and the characters have not changed, period. And kind of leaves you a little bit frustrated. At the same time, that's not the point of it, and it really forces you to deal with whatever issue, human condition that the author's going after. There's something really beautiful about that as well. That the characters, you're not actually watching them evolve and change. It really forces you into the issue, or I would like to say the human condition aspect that the author's going after.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've been talking about, Elijah, is sometimes it's actually harder in those bigger books to really focus in on the point that's being made, because you get caught up and you're involved and invested in the characters, you're involved in things that are changing, and so sometimes it's actually easier if the characters aren't changing, the plot isn't changing, and we can just follow through what's going on. And the main contrast that we wanted to bring out in this lesson is how the theme is conveyed. So with short stories, we are looking at one main theme that can be conveyed. That's all you have time for.
Yeah. Can we jump back and just repeat the characteristics of a short story, those properties that make a short story what it is? And we started out saying they were short.
Yeah.
Right? So we went through and said they were short. The next thing we said was that the setting is pretty, it's one, max 2, but normally it's just like one setting. You don't get to change settings, time and place in a short story, just even based on their condition. But I'd also even point out, I think not only the fact that it's short and you don't get the development, I think it's intentional. Again, I don't just feel like it allows us to deal with the issue. I think it forces us to just constantly be thinking about what is the issue of the human condition they're dealing with. And then we talk about plot, development, or character development, I think. The characters aren't necessarily changing. And oftentimes when you're evaluating something, you ask, all right, or with a novel at least, what does the main character want? What's in their way? And what do they do to overcome what's in their way? And you can begin to kind of follow that storyline that way. But with short story, we're not doing that at all. I think it's beautiful how it begins, just the properties of a short story, the things that make a short story what it is, force us really to just deal with that issue and that theme that they're going after, which we're kind of getting ready to talk about now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's something definitely to consider as we're reading through these short stories, to think about what is the setting and how it doesn't change. Is there any character development at all? And if it is, it should be limited. And then finally, what is that one theme that is trying to be drawn out? And one thing you'll see as we go through, especially the story that we'll be reading today, is that the theme coming through the story is dependent on the fact that the characters in the story are not going to change. And so with that, I wanted to add one quote from Edgar Allan Poe. We will be doing an Edgar Allan Poe story in this class. He's one of the most famous, if not the most famous, short story writer, but he was also considered one of the biggest critics of the short story genre. Not critics in the sense that he was critical or derogatory towards the genre, but just in the sense when people looked at people who really were authoritative on the short story, Edgar Allan Poe was at the top of that list. And so he says about a short story writer, if wise, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a certain or unique single effect to be wrought out, he then invents such incidents. He then combines such events as must best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. If his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. And so there you see Poe's going after that point that, one, the short story writer doesn't come up with a story and then think, what main theme can I bring out of this? He comes up with his theme and then he fashions the story to fit that theme. And like Poe is saying, there's not enough time in the short story to kind of dance around. If it's not contributing to the main theme, it really shouldn't be in there. I know we've all read novels or other books that are more lengthy, where you can go pages at a time and kind of wonder what is being contributed to the main story. Not so with the short story. Every part of the story needs to contribute to that main theme.
I think that even projects on the larger category of literature itself, in the sense that by and large, there's an intentionality. They're not just coming up with a neat, plot and theme. I'm just going to write that. There's an intentionality in how they bring out what they're doing. Obviously, the short story. I love how it says that first sentence. I mean, they are intentional with that, getting to the theme. Let's make this happen. But in literature, one of the beauties of it is that there is an intentionality with going after a theme or more than one theme, maybe depending on what they're doing, and really, really going after that. I think it just speaks to literature itself, and we see it right here in the short story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are different kinds. There's kind of subgenres within the short story. There's a lot of them that we could talk about. In the 3 short stories that we will be doing, there are really 2 genres that are going to be covered. There's the realist genre and the impressionist genre. And the realist genre is the first 2 stories that we're going to do, the ones that we'll be covering this week. And in that genre, the view of the story is shaped through a realistic narration. And so you're gonna read a story, and it's as if you're reading what happened, and not that the author's view isn't shaping the story, but it's that there's no real interference through the author's thoughts. And so you'll be reading it more as it happened. A lot of realist stories would be in the third person, where you're not even seeing it through specifically one person's eyes. And then the impressionist story, this was more Edgar Allan Poe's forte, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and some others. And in this genre, the view of the story is actually shaped through the impression of the narrator. So it's a lot of times not always told in the first person, but a lot of times it will be. And that's because the author's thoughts, how he is viewing the story is entirely shaping the story. There's really no way to get outside of his perception and look at the story objectively. So the Telltale Heart, the one that we'll be doing in this class, is an example of that, where everything that you're seeing has already been distorted by really the psychological state of the narrator. And so, but this week we will be doing stories from the realist genre. So both of these stories are told in the third person, and they're narrated clearly. So we will be able to see some of the characters' thoughts, but they're not distorting their narrative. They're not moving it to the point of where it's hard to get an objective view. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to read our first story here in this class, and there'll be links sent out to the PDFs of the stories so that you can read along as we're reading this one. We're going to be doing The Lady or the Tiger by Frank Stockton. And so I just wanted, before we do that, just to keep in mind what we've gone through in this first class, which is these stages of reading well. And so what we're going to be focusing on is that first stage, that anatomy of content stage that we're going through. So the first part, which is what we're going to be doing, just going to be reading at a good pace. And the second part is going to be marking what you don't understand. Elijah, would you give a little bit just on that?
Yeah, so the reason we want to read at a good pace is because, again, this is a short story, but if you think of a novel, it would be easy to get lost in the forest of the novel if I'm like trying to define these words over here and then understand what this concept is over here, if I'm stopping every time to do that. And if you read it, you're going to get a more contextual understanding, and more than likely, you're going to actually be able to go back to those when we come back to them after the first reading, and you come back for understanding of the things that you mark, but you're probably already going to at least contextually have an idea of what he's talking about, or he or she, depending on the author. And then you'll be able to really, then when you go for that understanding, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've been reading something and I stop and try to understand it. So now I understand the words that I didn't understand, and maybe I understand a certain concept, but I'm still not able to put it in. Think about this though, if you read through it at a good pace, you've marked those things, at this point you have a contextual understanding of the whole. When you come back to get that specific understanding, you're going to walk away with something that you can actually have and use and partake and give to others to partake in. So that's this idea of reading at a good pace and marking those things. And again, for this first stage, I don't know if you want me to go into this, but the idea is just know what the content is saying. I'm not asking what your opinion is. We're not asking even the logic that was used to come to the conclusion of the story, right? We're not there yet. Just what is said, and can I cite that? And so we're giving you this process to help you do it, to get a contextual understanding of, or a whole understanding of it. And then when we move on to the next stage, you're going to be armed, because you're going to be able to cite something and actually bring evidence for it instead of just asserting your own opinion. And there's a quote, I don't remember if you said this or I read this somewhere else, but it said the world is filled with uninformed opinions, right? We will not accept that in this class from ourselves or you, and it's not that it won't happen, but we're going to call each other out on it. And we're going to make sure we understand the content. So right now it's just, what is the content?
Yeah, and so the next stage of this will be, the last two parts will be the 2-sentence summary and the new title and 17th century subtitle. So in the short story, we don't have quite as many natural breaks as you would have in a novel or even in a drama. And so what I would encourage you to do is just take every couple paragraphs and give a little summary, even if it's a 1-sentence summary of what's going on, but just break it up little by little and give those summaries and then put them all together. And then lastly, give the story a new title and that 17th century subtitle that we talked about in the introductory class.
Yeah, and as you read through something, you'll kind of note there's a little difference here. Like in this Lady and the Tiger, she's going to introduce the setting, so to speak. She's going to introduce this kingdom and this king who has, I don't want to get into that too much, but who views things a certain way and does it a certain way. That's kind of like a section. Then she's going to get into the actual event that's taking place. And then you'll see that she's going to kind of pull off and talk about humanity through the eyes of this, I think it was a princess, right? Oh yeah, the title princess. So you can kind of begin to break it up even into sections naturally. So I want to encourage you, don't just say, all right, 3 paragraphs, I'm going to stop and write a summary. No, when you see that there's been a shift in focus, let's stop and let's write a couple sentence summary for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and particularly with this story that we're going to read right here, I would encourage you, like Elijah was saying, don't get so bogged down in having to check every single word that you don't understand. This is an older story. There are going to be some words in there that you don't understand, but just read through, mark ones that you're really not understanding and keep reading. And I think when you go back after having a grasp of the whole story, you'll be able to fit those words back in contextually. So what we're going to do is we're going to read. You'll have had the PDF sent to you if you want to read along, or if you want just to listen. If you are going to listen all the way through the first time, I would definitely encourage you to read through it after listening to it, and then just have those anatomy of content stages in mind. Write down your thoughts, and we'll bring them ready to discuss. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this story, and then we'll go through after that. So this is The Lady or the Tiger by Frank R. Stockton. In the very olden time, there lived a semi-barbaric king whose ideas, though somewhat polished and sharpened by the progressiveness of distant Latin neighbors, were still large, florid, and untrammeled, as became the half of him which was barbaric. He was a man of exuberant fancy, and withal of an authority so irresistible that at his will he turned his varied fancies into facts. He was greatly given to self-communing, and when he and himself agreed upon anything, the thing was done. When every member of his domestic and political systems moved smoothly in its appointed course, his nature was bland and genial. But whenever there was a little hitch, and some of his orbs got out of their orbits, he was blander and more genial still, for nothing pleased him so much as to make the crooked straight and crush down uneven places. Among the borrowed notions by which his barbarism had become semified was that of the public arena, in which, by exhibitions of manly and beastly valor, the minds of his subjects were refined and cultured. But even here the exuberant and barbaric fancy asserted itself. The arena of the king was built not to give the people an opportunity of hearing the rhapsodies of dying gladiators, nor to enable them to view the inevitable conclusion of a conflict between religious opinions and hungry jaws, but for purposes far better adapted to widen and develop the mental energies of the people. This vast amphitheater, with its encircling galleries, its mysterious vaults, and its unseen passages, was an agent of poetic justice, in which crime was punished, or virtue rewarded, by the decrees of an impartial and incorruptible chance. When a subject was accused of a crime of sufficient importance to interest the king, public notice was given that on an appointed day, the fate of the accused person would be decided in the king's arena. A structure which well deserved its name, for although its form and plan were borrowed from afar, its purpose emanated solely from the brain of this man, who every barleycorn a king knew no tradition to which he owed more allegiance than pleased his fancy, and who engrafted on every adopted form of human thought and action the rich growth of his barbaric idealism. When all the people had assembled in the galleries, and the king, surrounded by his court, sat high up on his throne of royal state on one side of the arena, he gave a signal. A door beneath him opened, and the accused subject stepped out into the amphitheater. Directly opposite him, on the other side of the enclosed space, were 2 doors, exactly alike and side by side. It was the duty and the privilege of the person on trial to walk directly to these doors and open one of them. He could open either door he pleased. He was subject to no guidance or influence but that of the aforementioned impartial and incorruptible chance. If he opened the one, there came out of it a hungry tiger, the fiercest and most puerile that could be procured, which immediately sprang upon him and tore him to pieces as a punishment for his guilt. The moment that the case of the criminal was thus decided, doleful iron bells were clanged, Great wails went up from the hired mourners posted on the outer rim of the arena, and the vast audience, with bowed heads and downcast hearts, wended their way slowly homeward, mourning greatly that one so young and fair, or so old and respected, should have merited so dire a fate. But if the accused person opened the other door, there came forth from it a lady, the most suitable to his years and station that his majesty could select among his fair subjects. And to this lady he was immediately married, as a reward of his innocence. It mattered not that he might already possess a wife and a family, or that his affections might be engaged upon an object of his own selection. The king allowed no such subordinate or arrangements to interfere with his great scheme of retribution and reward. The exercises, as in the other instance, took place immediately, in the arena. Another door opened beneath the king, and a priest, followed by a band of choristers and dancing maidens, blowing joyous airs on golden horns and treading an epithalamic measure, advanced to where the pair stood, side by side, and the wedding was promptly and cheerily solemnized. Then the gay brass bells rang forth their merry peals, the people shouted glad hurrahs, and the innocent man, preceded by children, strewing flowers on his path, led his bride to his home. This was the king's semi-barbaric method of administering justice. Its perfect fairness is obvious. The criminal could not know out of which door would come the lady. He opened either he pleased, without having the slightest idea whether in the next instance he was to be devoured or married. On some occasions, the tiger came out of one door, and on some out of the other. The decisions of this tribunal were not only fair, they were positively determinate. The accused person was instantly punished if he found himself guilty, and if innocent, he was rewarded on the spot, whether he liked it or not. There was no escape from the judgments of the king's arena. The institution was a very popular one. When the people gathered together on one of the great trial days, they never knew whether they were to witness a bloody slaughter or a hilarious wedding. This element of uncertainty lent an interest to the occasion which it could not have otherwise attained. Thus the masses were entertained and pleased, and the thinking part of the community could bring no charge of unfairness against this plan, for did not the accused person have the whole matter in his own hands? The semi-barbaric king had a daughter as blooming as his most florid fancies, and with a soul as fervent and imperious as his own. As is usual in such cases, she was the apple of his eye and was loved by him above all humanity. Among his courtiers was a young man of that fineness of blood and lowness of station common to the conventional heroes of romance who love royal maidens. This royal maiden was well satisfied with her lover, for he was handsome and brave to a degree unsurpassed in all this kingdom, and she loved him with an ardor that had enough of barbarism in it to make it exceedingly warm and strong. This love affair moved on happily for many months, until one day the king happened to discover its existence. He did not waver or hesitate in regard to his duty in the premises. The youth was immediately cast into prison, and a day was appointed for his trial in the king's arena. This, of course, was an especially important occasion, and His Majesty, as well as all the people, was greatly interested in the working and development of this trial. Never before had such a case occurred. Never before had a subject dared to love the daughter of the king. And in after years, such things became commonplace enough. But then they were in no slight degree novel and startling. The tiger cages of the kingdom were searched for the most savage and relentless beasts, from which the fiercest monster might be selected for the arena, and the ranks of maiden youth and beauty throughout the land were carefully surveyed by competent judges in order that the young man might have a fitting bride in case fate did not determine for him a different destiny. Of course, everybody knew that the deed with which the accused was charged had been done. He had loved the princess, and neither he, she, nor anyone else thought of denying the fact. But the king would not think of allowing any fact of this kind to interfere with the workings of the tribunal, in which he took such great delight and satisfaction. No matter how the affair turned out, the youth would be disposed of, and the king would take an aesthetic pleasure in watching the course of events, which would determine whether or not the young man had done wrong in allowing himself to love the princess. The appointed day arrived. From far and near the people gathered and thronged the great galleries of the arena, and crowds, unable to gain admittance, massed themselves against its outside walls. The king and his courts were in their places opposite the twin doors, those fateful portals, so terrible in their similarity. All was ready. The signal was given. A door beneath the royal party opened, and the lover of the princess walked into the arena. Tall, beautiful, fair, His appearance was greeted with a low hum of admiration and anxiety. Half the audience had not known so grand a youth had lived among them. No wonder the princess loved him. What a terrible thing for him to be there. As the youth advanced into the arena, as the custom was, he turned to bow to the king, but he did not think at all of that royal personage. His eyes were fixed upon the princess, who sat to the right of her father. Had it not been from the moiety of barbarism in her nature, it is probable the lady would not have been there, but her intense and fervid soul would not allow her to be absent on an occasion in which she was so terribly interested. From the moment that the decree had gone forth that her lover should decide his fate in the king's arena, she had thought of nothing, night or day, but this great event and the various subjects connected with it. Possessed of more power, influence, and force of character than anyone who had ever before been interested in such a case, she had done what no other person had done. She had possessed herself of the secret of the doors. She knew in which of the two rooms that lay behind those doors stood the cage of the tiger with its open front, and in which waited the lady. Through those thick doors, heavily curtained with skins on the inside, it is impossible that any noise or suggestion should come from within to the person who should approach to raise the latch of one of them. But gold and the power of a woman's will had brought the secret to the princess. And not only did she know in which room stood the lady, ready to emerge, all blushing and radiant, should her door be opened, but she knew who the lady was. It was one of the fairest and loveliest of the damsels of the court who had been selected as a reward of the accused youth, should he be proved innocent of the crime of aspiring to one so far above him. And the princess hated her. Often had she seen, or imagined that she had seen, this fair creature throwing glances of admiration upon the person of her lover, and sometimes she thought these glances were perceived, and even returned. Now and then she had seen them talking together. It was but for a moment or two, but how much can be said in a brief space? It may have been on most unimportant topics, but how could she know that? The girl was lovely, but she had dared to raise her eyes to the loved one of the princess, and with all the intensity of the savage blood transmitted to her through long lines of holy barbaric ancestors, she hated the woman who blushed and trembled behind that silent door. When her lover turned and looked at her, and his eyes met hers as she sat there, paler and whiter than anyone in the vast ocean of anxious faces about her, he saw by that quick power of perception, which is given to those whose souls are one, that she knew behind which door crouched the tiger, and behind which stood the lady. He had expected her to know it. He understood her nature, and his soul was assured that she would never rest until she had made plain to herself this thing, hidden to all other lookers on, even the king. The only hope for the youth in which there was any element of certainty was based upon the success of the princess in discovering this mystery, and the moment he looked upon her, he saw that she had succeeded. As in his soul, he knew she would succeed. Then it was his quick and anxious glance asked the question, which? It was as plain to her as if he shouted it from where he stood. There was not an instant to be lost. The question was asked in a flash, it must be answered in another. Her right arm lay on the cushioned parapet before her. She raised her hand and made a slight, quick movement toward the right. No one but her lover saw her. Every eye but his was fixed on the man in the arena. He turned, and with a firm and rapid step, he walked across the empty space. Every heart stopped beating. Every breath was held. Every eye was fixed immovably upon that man. Without the slightest hesitation, he went to the door on the right and opened it. Now the point of the story is this. Did the tiger come out of that door, or did the lady? The more we reflect upon this question, the harder it is to answer. It involves a study of the human heart, which leads us through devious mazes of passion, and out of which it is difficult to find our way. Think of it, fair reader, not as if the decision of the question depended upon yourself, but upon that hot-blooded, semi-barbaric princess, her soul at a white heat beneath the combined fires of despair and jealousy. She had lost him, but who should have him? How often in her waking hours and in her dreams had she started in wild horror and covered her face with her hands as she thought of her lover opening the door, on the other side of which waited the cruel fangs of the tiger. But how much oftener had she seen him at the other door? How in her grievous reveries had she gnashed her teeth and torn her hair when she saw his start of rapturous delight as he opened the door of the lady. How her soul had burned in agony when she had seen him rush to meet that woman with her flushing cheek and sparkling eye of triumph, when she had seen him lead her forth. His whole frame kindled with the joy of recovered life when she had heard the glad shouts of the multitude, and with the wild ringing of the bells when she had seen the priest with his joyous followers advance to the couple and make them man and wife before her very eyes, and when she had seen them walk away together upon their path of flowers, followed by the tremendous shouts of the hilarious multitude, in which her one despairing shriek was lost and drowned. Would it not be better for him to die at once and go and wait for her in the blessed regions of semi-barbaric futurity? And yet that awful tiger, those shrieks, that blood. Her decision had been indicated in an instant, but it had been made after days and nights of anguished deliberation. She had known she would be asked. She had decided what she would answer, and without the slightest hesitation, she moved her hand to the right. The question of her decision is one not to be lightly considered. And it is not for me to presume to set myself up as the one person to answer it. And so I leave it with all of you. Which came out of the open door? The lady or the tiger?
That is good. Boy, that is good.
So you can see in a story, it's not a long story, but the power of a theme and just how in one sitting you can just be invested in that story. So we're going to be going through it. I encourage you to read it again, go through those stages, write down, get all what is being said, just the cold hard facts, what is being said, what is out there on the table, and then come ready to discuss it. Do you have any other else to give on that?
Well, so basically you're talking about an assignment right now.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just clarify, this is the assignment you have to do and this is what's required. So we'll be looking for this. We'll post this on Google Classroom for you. So obviously you've watched the lesson now, but we'll post the assignment as well, and that will be expected. So why don't we clarify what exactly we're looking for from them. Is it an option that they read it and think about it? Is it an option that they take some notes? Or is this like, no, this is what we're expecting?
Yeah, no, this is your assignment. So you will need to read through this again. You will need to take notes and marking what you understand. We'll need to see some record of that, whether you want to write down terms or words or just phrases, questions, things like that. Write those down. All those summaries and that title and 17th century subtitle will need to be turned in as well. And then for Monday, we want you to have read The Most Dangerous Game. That's another one that we'll be attaching in the PDF with you. You can start going through those stages. That will help you, but that will not be due on Monday like this one will be. But I encourage you to, you will need to have read it, and then I would encourage you to start going through those stages.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we are looking forward to getting more discussion and talking through these things more on Monday.
Sounds great.
God bless.
All right, I'll see you then.